Hello and welcome. It's just after 4 o'clock here in the afternoon in Singapore. So very good afternoon to all who are joining us today from our island, and good morning or good evening to those joining us from around the world for this webinar, Navigating the Carbon Services Industry. This webinar is brought to you by the NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions, the NUS Energy Studies Institute, and the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. We're grateful that you have taken the time out of your busy schedules to join us. My name is Melissa Loh. I'm a research fellow at the Energy Studies Institute at the National University of Singapore, and I have the great pleasure of being your host and moderator today. Before we begin, do allow me to go through some housekeeping details. So this webinar is being recorded and we'll be sharing the video on the NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions YouTube page. So all you need to do is search for NUS CNCS. If at any time you have any issues technically, please type into the chat and our assistants will get to you. As this event is being set up in a webinar format, participants are not able to raise their hands or unmute to ask questions. So in order for us to begin our Q&A session later promptly, we ask that you pose your questions in the Q&A box. And it would be really helpful if you could also ask your questions in this format. So put the name of the panelist to whom you'd like to direct your question to, and then your question. So I'm sure many of you have already thought of questions you might want to ask. So you can already start using the Q&A box for this. And the Zoom Q&A function has this really great upvoting function. And so you may upvote your questions that you want answered by our speakers and we'll get to them sooner. And as I said, if you face any technical difficulties at all during the webinar, please contact our host via the live the chat function. So let's begin. Today, we have a distinguished lineup of experts here to share on the carbon services industry here in Singapore. They will give us an overview of the emerging nature-based carbon credits market and how such an ecosystem for carbon-related services can generate new economic value and jobs for Singapore and beyond our shores. So this is the program for this afternoon. Each of our speakers will share remarks for 10 to 12 minutes. This will then be followed by a 30-minute Q&A segment, and we have to end promptly at 5 p.m. Singapore time because our speakers are all very, very busy. So now let me introduce our first speaker for this afternoon. Dr. Maria Carvalho has over 12 years of research and advisory experience helping governments set ambitious climate policy to mobilize the private sector and to take climate action. She led the South Pole Vivid Economics and GECO Consortium this year on the study of how Singapore can become a carbon services hub. She has a PhD and Master's in Climate Policy from the London School of Economics and an undergraduate in Economics and Development from Queen's University in Canada. Maria, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And if I could go to my slides. So I just wanted to say thank you to NUS and also to all the other panelists. I've been really enjoying the opportunity to really think about what it means to be a carbon services hub. We at South Pole work across the carbon services value chain, and also we work with our partners NGECO and Vivid. And it was just a wonderful opportunity to really reflect on our industry, how it's evolved and how it needs to evolve in the future, and what the role Singapore has to play here. So if you can go to the next slide. So when you think about carbon services, really the key thing about it is it's any type of service that focuses on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I know most people are thinking about, well, it's about carbon trading, but actually there's so much more to what a carbon services is in order to support decarbonization of economies. So the key thing you're talking about here is really, how do I get those tons of CO2 down? So it's everything from advocacy and research to types of advisory data and market analysis that are needed to be able to track how CO2 is being reduced. A lot of governance and infrastructure needed to ensure that there's actual environmental integrity to that decarbonization. And then the core things that most people think about, which is how do you finance and trade decarbonization? Primarily, most people think carbon commodities, but it could also be financing within a company to reduce their own emissions. And then there's also project development, the different types of projects that tend to go through a certification process where you reduce emissions. So that's what we call project development. And then insurance and legal services that are used to actually support decarbonization efforts, and specifically to carbon trading in this way. But beyond that, it could also include innovation ecosystem and green services. So what do you mean by green services? It could be HR recruitment, innovation, different types of IT platforms that can support that. And we're seeing so many carbon footprinting and trading apps. So it really is a ripe space, but it's all about decarbonization. If you go to the next slide. So, like I said, though carbon trading or carbon markets is one part of what carbon services are, it's normally the thing that most people focus on. And I know not everyone here is familiar with what a carbon market is. And primarily what it is, it's about placing a price on a ton of CO2. And so that price can be placed within compliance markets. So a government would have set a specific target, and if you go beyond that target, they will set a specific sets of permits, what we call allowances, and you can surrender allowance if you go beyond your threshold. But there's another type of carbon commodity called carbon credits, which is basically you finance an emission reduction. It goes through a robust and verified process that an actual reduction has occurred or even a removal has occurred. But in both cases, carbon credit allowances are a permit that you have polluted 1 ton and you're surrendering it. Carbon credits are more a verification of a ton of CO2 that has been reduced. And both types of commodities can be used in a compliance market, depending on how the government has set that policy. But they can also, carbon credits only will be used in a voluntary market, and that's used to compensate for emissions that a company has emitted. And so it's a way for them to, actually account for their climate damages. So that's a very important thing in thinking about what these different carbon commodities are, and what a carbon market is the trade of these commodities. And it's very important because it creates a real price on what the carbon dioxide emissions is. If you can go to the next slide. So when we're looking at what the different services are, what I really wanted to point out is that this is a very interconnected system. When we're talking about decarbonization and carbon services, there are different functions. So that on the top, you will see the function for knowledge and advisory, which helps shape how it kind of really helps you track and then also think about how you can reduce emissions over time. And it's a really market shaper in that way. Function 2, which is the boxes on the left-hand side, is really about carbon project development. So specifically to carbon credit development that can also be traded in the function, which is on the right. So it's different types of quantity trading, also allowances are allowed there. And then you have a bunch of intermediary services, which is governance and infrastructure, insurance, and legal support that help the whole system go. And so the function 4, which is markets acceleration, which I've talked about. So just to really understand, this is a very interconnected system. Not one side dominates, but they all work together. And you need all these different types of services in order to actually really become a hub, or to understand how it spreads across the value chain. So I can go to the next slide. So now that we've talked about carbon services, how they interact in a carbon service value chain, the key question is, where do these services actually cluster? And that's what I mean by a hub. So it's a clustering of the top firms and skilled talent in a specific place. So here we're going to geography, but it's not just about the clustering of it, it's also their linkages. So carbon service hubs, what we've seen, so we did a study across the different basically where carbon services were located and what their linkages were. And so one of the key things that came out of that was that carbon services hubs actually attracts a lot of foreign actors or subsidiaries who are interested in setting up their business there, working there in order to enable carbon service development. But also has a lot of outward linkages, because the thing about decarbonization and decarbonizing the global economy, there's a lot of knowledge. You need to cooperate together. There's a lot of learning happening, both in terms of setting up governance systems. So the Paris Agreement is a good example of international cooperation, but also different types of what we call climate clubs, where there's a lot of knowledge sharing and types of solutions based, like how to do trading, how to set up or link markets. And the carbon services themselves also have those kind of links to external regions, also to provide those services, enable investment and cooperation. And so you kind of have this types of carbon services hubs. You can, if you were to do an intersection of whether they're inward or outward, you can have those which are much more outward. So they're a lot more global in providing their services, while you can also have those that are much more domestic, that their focus on being a carbon services hub is really to support the domestic market. And so, and then you also have things like generalists or specialists. So there's specialists, what we mean is they really focus on some part of the carbon services value chain, and they're really the leaders there, while generalists, they cover the full gamut of services in the carbon services value chain. And so the three key carbon service hubs that we had seen, and we kind of, really try to understand as a way of advising Singapore as well. So Global Generalist was London. It's clearly one of the top four in terms of clustering of services and inward and outward linkages. Global Specialist was Amsterdam. It's a big specialist in terms of financing and trading carbon commodities. And then something that was much more domestic was Shanghai. It is, China is going to be the largest carbon market in the world. A lot of Shanghai attracts, and a lot of the carbon services is to actually support the domestic market. So it's really interesting in seeing that kind of what makes a carbon service hub and how could you characterize it? So if you go to the next. So one of the key things, we were given the task of saying, how can we make Singapore a carbon services hub? And when we were actually doing this database and thinking about what makes a carbon services hub, what we realized was Singapore actually already is a carbon services hub, particularly for that region. So Singapore is a services hub. And because it's a services hub, it also already has pre-existing advantages of, it already has an existing ecosystem of services. It's a service economy. In terms of it's already a commodity trading hub. It has the highest concentration of regional headquarters of multinational companies, especially coming from Europe and North America. Why that's important is because European and North American firms are having a lot of pressure to address their carbon footprint. And that means operations around the world, including in Southeast Asia. So because they have their headquarters here, they're going to be managing a lot of their Southeast Asia carbon footprint from their offices here. And also Singapore, as you know, has a very strong ecosystem of services in terms of legal, insurance, advisory, and finance. So that's generally services. When we talk about carbon services hub, we're talking also about Singapore is one of the leading countries here and Southeast Asian in terms of a favorable policy and regulatory environment. So strong climate policy, but also very important stable governance. And that's needed in terms of the coordination in terms of both climate, but also supporting services and also being able to attract foreign companies. And that can also explain Singapore itself is very attractive to cluster carbon services, both in terms of geography and culture. One of the key things about here, because what Singapore is doing is it's attracting other companies to work in Singapore to then provide carbon services, but also the other way around. And so it's very favorable in terms of operating in a business English language. It also has access to large international demand with the voluntary and sectoral markets, particularly because it is a shipping and airport hub, and then also in terms of financing development of carbon projects in neighboring countries. So all of these geographically and culturally make it very attractive. If you can go to the next slide. So really, when we think about that, what are the specific services that Singapore can play, and especially in supporting decarbonized efforts in Southeast Asia? It is financing and verifying carbon credits, trading and bundling carbon commodities. And this will really occur in the next 5 to 10 years. We're seeing a lot of demand already for voluntary and emerging compliance schemes in the area. But in the future, the market is going to be so much more sophisticated, and I actually would say it is actually getting a lot more sophisticated in terms of a lot of key data governance advisory services and also climate innovations. The kinds of things that are coming out to help people manage their carbon footprint is really there. Now, what it means in terms of the types of jobs that'll be in Singapore, really what you're doing is you're taking existing services that are already in Singapore and having a lot more people involved with the trading, finance, and law, but they're providing specific needs for carbon services. But then there's also scope for new jobs, which are not as familiar, which is greenhouse gas data, governance, and infrastructure. And that's a specific set of skills that enables the decarbonization to occur. So I'll leave it there and I'll hand it off to Ada.
Thanks, Maria. Thank you for your presentation about carbon services hubs and the role that Singapore can play. Just wanted to remind our attendees that if you have questions for our speakers, and I do see a couple in the chat box, I would kindly ask that you post them in the Q&A box so that everyone has access to them and we can also upvote the questions. But we see those that are in the chat box, but please do post them on the Q&A instead. Thanks again, Maria. Next up, we have Ms. Adeline Au, Vice President of Environmental Sustainability at the Singapore Economic Development Board. Adeline is Vice President at the EDB, a government agency under the Ministry of Trade and Industry, which is responsible for investment promotion and industry development. Adeline leads EDB's efforts to decarbonize energy-intensive industries and to promote the growth of green activities such as carbon services and clean energy. Adeline, please.
Thanks very much, Melissa. I was going to give an introduction, but you've covered it for me. So maybe I can jump straight into the next slide, please. Thank you. So hi, everyone. Yeah, maybe let me start my remarks with a broader perspective of decarbonization and energy transition here in Southeast Asia. I think, around us, we are seeing a greater global consensus about the urgency and existential nature of addressing climate change. And we see that the low carbon transition is clearly gaining momentum, including right here. Singapore was the first country in Southeast Asia to implement a broad-based carbon tax in 2019. And since then, actually other regional governments are also considering emissions trading schemes or carbon taxes, and in some instances have started trials. So we also see that sustainability has become more of a business imperative. So at the EDB, we talk to companies, we talk to industries, and we are having more and deeper conversations with companies, including those based in Asia, interested to figure out how they can act and also be part of the solution. At the same time, demand for fuels and chemicals is still growing because urbanization is continuing, especially in our region. And each country faces very different and unique challenges. For example, in Singapore, as a small city state with really very little natural resources or land, there are significant limits to affordable renewable energy access. And so, the complexity of sustaining and intensifying our energy transition and also keeping it affordable are very important issues that we need to navigate. So we see this as an opportunity to bring in expertise and also create new scalable solutions and services that can support the region's climate change and energy transition needs. Southeast Asia, in particular, also plays an important role in enabling global decarbonization because of its natural assets and resources. So Southeast Asia has almost 15% of the world's tropical forests and contains the world's highest concentration of blue carbon stocks with over 5 million hectares of mangrove forests and seagrass meadows. It's also rich in renewable energy resources, which can also be harnessed to meet regional and global climate goals. Next slide. So so what are we working towards here and what do we hope to see? First, we would like to see the development of vibrant, trusted, and well-functioning carbon markets that can serve the region's needs and deliver global impact. So countries around us, such as Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand, are all considering emissions trading schemes. And really, sustained progress in regional carbon market development is a key part of the portfolio of pathways that can help us to make an impact faster as we pursue other abatement efforts in tandem. At the same time, Southeast Asia can also be a source of credible and high quality carbon credits, given its vast potential as a carbon sink. So, in Singapore, we hope to play a part to help realize this potential. Secondly, we also hope to see greater corporate capacity in Southeast Asia to navigate climate change. As businesses face climate risks and increasing pressures from their stakeholders to address climate change, we will need to collectively level up capabilities to respond to these drivers. And taking action might require partnerships across industries, value chains, and supply chains. So we hope that Singapore can be that crossroad where businesses can find the right partners and enablers to develop innovative ways to reduce carbon-intensive practices and also create more sustainable products and services. Ultimately, what we hope to see, is the low carbon economy growing in Singapore and also in the region. And this will, hopefully create new jobs and business opportunities that, I hope many will find exciting and meaningful. For example, to develop regional carbon markets, as Maria had mentioned in her previous presentation, new expertise and solutions will be needed in areas, such as low carbon project development, financing, trading, and legal services. So all these, will have the potential to create new jobs and new growth opportunities. Next slide. And finally, let me give an overview of what we're doing here in Singapore. You can, I suppose, remember it simply, as the 3 E's that we're working on here: expertise, enablers, and enterprise. On building expertise, Singapore today has a budding ecosystem of carbon services firms. We are now home to more than 70 organizations providing carbon services. Carbon project developers and international organizations, including South Pole, World Bank, and Conservation International, are already using Singapore as a base for carbon market activities in the region. And we are working hard to grow this ecosystem. We are partnering with existing firms and also helping new potential entrants to expand their capabilities in Singapore and the region. At the same time, investing in research and analysis is also very important. And this is because we need a deeper understanding of how different methodologies and solutions apply in our regional context so that projects can deliver real impact through scientifically robust methods. And that's why we are helping to advance research in natural ecosystems in Asia. So NUS members in the audience would be familiar with the work being done by the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. And I also recently met Professor Sanjay from the NUS Environmental Research Institute as well, and he generously shared with me his work on peatlands, which is being undertaken with regional partners. On the second area of developing enablers, we want to increase and sustain trust in carbon markets. So we are working very closely with the World Bank and also IETA, or the International Emissions Trading Association, to develop the climate warehouse, which is expected to address long-standing issues such as double counting of credits. At the same time, we are facilitating the growth of marketplaces that can promote price transparency, liquidity, and the trade of high-quality credits in Singapore and beyond. And that includes the Climate Impact X, which was born out of the Emerging Stronger Task Force, which was a recent public-private effort to chart new possibilities for Singapore's economy. And finally, on encouraging enterprise, we hope to promote greater innovation activities and partnerships in Singapore that can help to create solutions in carbon services, especially those that are applicable to Southeast Asia. Many are already happening organically here. But beyond that, we are also embarking on capacity building programs that can help corporates here to build greater awareness of climate risks and undertake credible climate actions. So we hope that with these efforts, Singapore can help to make a difference in supporting the regional and global climate agenda. So I'll end it here. Thank you. Handing it back to Melissa.
Thank you very much, Adeline, for your remarks on the growth of green activities such as carbon services here in Singapore and in the region. Certainly very exciting times for us. So our last presenter is actually Ms. Harry Cho, Managing Director and Head of Sustainability and Sustainable Finance at the Singapore Exchange. And of course, earlier Adeline mentioned Climate Impact Exchange or Climate Impact X. So I believe Harry will be going through that a bit, but let me just introduce her. Ms. Harry Cho joined Singapore Exchange as Managing Director and Head of Sustainability and Sustainable Finance in February of this year. She drives SGX's sustainability and sustainable finance strategic direction and implementation with the aim of transforming SGX and its ecosystem into a world-class, trusted multi-asset sustainable exchange. Ms. Cho pioneered in the development of Asia-Pacific's sustainable finance markets. And there she led the origination and execution of sustainable finance transactions, including green, social, sustainability bonds and loans, and delivered sustainability advisory to key clients. Harry, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Well, I think my presentation will flow quite nicely from what Maria put into context as to what makes the Carbon Services Hub to what Adeline shared as to what Singapore is trying to do. And perhaps I can share a little bit about what we're actually doing. Of course, there are others who are doing it too, but I can share how we're working together with the ecosystem for this. Next slide, please. Before we delve into the carbon markets and carbon itself, it's probably worth putting it into a little bit of a context as to where it actually fits in. Now, keeping in mind that SGX is a financial markets infrastructure and backbone, we're at the heart of the ecosystem. And so also creation of carbon markets was part of that overarching vision to create a leading sustainable and credible transition finance and trade hub, completely aligned to what Adeline was mentioning before as well, with end-to-end financial product solutions and ecosystem with 4 key lenses to see that. And what's really important, which I'll touch upon in the next few slides, is ensuring that you have credibility. And credibility comes from you having set certain commitments and future-looking direction for the company or entity to chart the way and disclose quite transparently where you're heading with respect to, for example, net zero or decarbonization, etc. Next slide, please. So within this big table, and this will continue to grow. So Melissa introduced that we have multi-asset classes where we're embedding ESG solutions into. If you look at the last pillar, you'll see Climate Impact X, a carbon exchange and marketplace. Some of the other carbon-related initiatives are, for example, REX offering, also important, and greening of certain industries, whether that be maritime or rubber industry, with more information becoming available, etc. Next slide, please. Specifically, when you look at decarbonization, now it's very important to know how and when to use a carbon credit. If you are a private entity, you're looking to purchase voluntary carbon credits, so you're adhering to voluntary decarbonization, standard science-based targets, etc. And there's something called carbon mitigation hierarchy that you should actually centrally know what your carbon footprint is, where are the material emissions within your whole value chain from scope 1, 2, and 3. And actually set the targets. So looking towards the future, yes, net zero overall is looking at a long time frame, but there is increasing movement in the financial world and the corporate world for sure as well, to ensure that you actually have a short to mid-term interim targets that support that long-term target to 2050 and beyond. So to focus your emission targets, reduction targets, ideally based upon science, that will lead to that well below 2 degree or 1.5 degree pathway, and to focus on the actual absolute emissions footprint reduction before you actually start to, within your operations as well as the supply chain, by the way, before you start to delve into offsetting or carbon credits, etc. But once you are on that journey of absolute reduction, carbon credits do have a role in your overall climate mitigation strategy. The 2 key ways that you can look at that is, 1, neutralization. So there will still be unavoidable residual emissions as you go down that pathway of decarbonization. And so neutralization refers to, in particular, removal of carbon from the atmosphere that can come in the form of projects that actually get directly financed by companies, or in the form of credits that's outside your value chain, for example. So neutralization is focusing on removal. And then there is compensation. Now compensation, so as you decrease, there will still be emissions. So year to year, the best practice today is to still aim to compensate for that emission you're still making. And that's where there is a broad acceptance that other forms of carbon credits, reduction credits, etc., they can still be utilized there to offset your ongoing, or rather compensate your ongoing emissions. And finally, it's very important to continue to disclose not only your targets, but your ongoing progress across these 5 components. Next slide, please. Oh, by the way, this is captured in this report that we had published with partners CDP, Climate Bonds Initiative, and law firm HFW earlier this year, and is publicly available as well. Next slide, please. So again, putting that all into context, you have to, as an entity, look at that overall process, you know, how you're going to finance it, how you're going to actually reduce it, and then how does the carbon mitigation strategy through carbon credits come into play? They're all interlinked, and it's important for people to educate yourselves as to when and how to use credible carbon credits methodology. Next slide, please. So what actually makes a quality carbon credit or high quality carbon credit? There are a few key components that one can think about. Number one, are the projects, that underlying project that Maria mentioned that leads to, you know, certification in reduction or removal of 1 ton of CO2, is it real? Does the project actually exist? Number two, is it permanent? If it's a natural climate solution project for afforestation or prevention of deforestation, will those trees actually be still in existence in 30 years? Additionality, by the supply of the funding that comes from carbon credits, is that leading to additionality in a sense that would that project have existed without the carbon credit? No leakage. Just because you're conserving one part, is tree chopping going on the next plot, you know, so no leakage to ensure that there is that transition towards achieving net zero emissions, and avoidance of double counting, double claiming. There's all sorts of terminologies coming up now, but essentially to ensure that each carbon credit is unique and should only be used once to make a carbon reduction claim. And that is indeed also going to be heavily debated and negotiated during COP26 this year. Now, so these are some of the quality criteria, and what makes a high quality? Well, in particular for natural climate solutions, what may be important is the focus on the co-benefits above and beyond the climate change mitigation factors. What I mean by that are, for example, in Paris Agreement, not many people are aware that they don't only talk about climate change mitigation, but it also mentions that biodiversity and social aspects are as important. So what co-benefits are these carbon credits bringing to the market, whether that be in terms of verifiable biodiversity protection or social impact to the community that are delivering the projects that produce the carbon credits? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So talking about the voluntary carbon market, so Maria distinguished between the compliance markets and the voluntary carbon markets. The VCM, as I'll call it, it's been driven by the private sector for the private sector. And there's been real speed up, as you've seen in the lead up to COP26, with companies focusing on climate action. And one key driver has been increasing focus to have a credible pact towards net zero. There's any number of coalitions and entities out there that support this, and you'll only see tightening of standards over time, we believe, and coming together of these standards and coalitions to ensure that there is harmonization or comparability of the different standards. Next slide, please. So with that increasing pact, and as I mentioned, carbon credits having a role to play in a strategic climate change mitigation strategy of an entity, this will likely lead to exponential growth in the VCM. There are any number of estimates out there, but you can imagine that by 2030, there might be 15-fold of increase in the volumes, and several times that by 2050. Next slide, please. So to share a little bit about CIX, Adeline mentioned that this was born of PPP, or public partnership, public-private partnership. And CIX is a global exchange and marketplace for high quality carbon credits. And its key vision is to enable a scalable, such a keyword, scalable voluntary carbon market built on transparency, integrity, and quality. And indeed, there are 4 companies that are participating and collaborating together: DBS, SGX, Standard Chartered, and Temasek. Next slide, please. The goal, however, is that this should be a global exchange, by the way. So let me make that part clear. Now, there are 2 parts to CIX that is to be launched later this year. One is the project marketplace, and the other part is the exchange. And they will serve 2 slightly different uses of carbon credit by the supplier and in particular the buyer's practice, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I would like to also mention, though, that the CIX is not going to be just about creation of a marketplace and 4 shareholders coming together. This is really going to be about that ecosystem building, so that we are collectively creating a marketplace and transparency that buyers and suppliers want. So, for example, a carbon coalition is going to be a group of committed buyers and sellers who share that vision of scaling high quality carbon markets, starting with natural climate solutions. And then there will be International Advisory Council, which is an independent expert body that will be represented by think tanks, academic institutions, etc., who can actually guide that quality criteria of the carbon credits that will trade on CIX. Next slide, please. So project marketplace will indeed it will be sort of like a upgraded version of the OTC market where we have today, perhaps, where there will be a curated portfolio of high quality NCS projects that I had defined earlier, where you can indeed compare, buy and retire carbon credits with confidence. And there will be reporting and tracking of impact, and further enhanced by technology like satellite monitoring, rating based upon quality, and clear pricing data, pricing signals, so that a quality project can be, well, rather, different projects of quality can be compared more easily. Next slide, please. An exchange is actually more sort of a financial trading platform, if you'd like, a platform where buying and selling happens on standardized contracts backed by eligible credits. And so there'll be pooling or baskets of different credits from different projects, but within similar quality rating. So there will be uniquely designed project baskets, and there will be clear, transparent pricing signals so that we can create more liquid carbon credit contracts, and where buyers of scale can come to purchase. Next slide, please. I'll wrap it up very quickly. So I mentioned already that there'll be initial focus on NCS, so natural climate solutions, but it will expand further onto other credit categories in the future. Next slide, please. And by the way, so NCS is so important to focus in this part of the region, because this is what we need to protect. This is what we need to grow in terms of natural climate solutions. It is cost efficient versus some of the commercially driven or technology driven solutions. Yes, R&D needs to flow there, but we still need to protect what we have here. So just on a final note, it is about the fostering of the ecosystem, and not just about the buyers and sellers and the knowledge keepers, but also the technology firms who will deploy technology for the good, and building this into a global network of companies who are really looking to build that liquid, scalable carbon market system. Okay, back to you, Melissa.
Thank you very much, Harry. And thank you for everyone who's stayed with us so far. I think what all of our three speakers have shared is a lot, right? And I think many of us are still trying to understand the carbon services industry around the world, but also here in Singapore. And so I thought it would be great to start our Q&A segment with a question about capacity building. I think all of you, all of our speakers have spoken about capacity building to some extent. So we have one question I wanted to raise from the Q&A box. Someone asked about him or her being interested in greenhouse gas data related jobs. And what type of skills and certifications are required to join the carbon services sector or industry? The same person asked, should I get a certification from GHG protocol first? And how do we enter this field if his or her current job is totally not related in this field? I wonder if maybe Maria would like to start first.
Yes, when it comes to basically what we call carbon footprinting, the best place to go is the GHG protocol. It has an entire sets, including how to measure, what are the systems in place, and there's actually certification courses for that. So carbon footprinting is one of those interesting ones that it is something that you don't have to get an entire degree on. You can actually have certification courses that are available internationally that can help you transition to this kind of role. Just as a warning though, it's becoming highly automized. So what I would also recommend is there is the certification in terms of carbon footprinting, but there's also recognizing decarbonization for different sectors. That becomes a lot more tricky, but then that would be important in terms of taking courses either in engineering or in economics or environmental sciences, a combination of that really focus. So there's master's programs involved with figuring out how to decarbonize different sectors, and that way you can be in some ways specialized.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks, Maria. Harry, do you think that your background in finance is helpful as input to the current role that you're playing?
Well, SGX is indeed all about financial markets, so certainly does help. Some of the factors that are really helpful in what I do actually is going back to some of the earlier days of my career. So, I was doing mergers and acquisitions. And when you're valuing companies, you have to price in everything, including environmental, social factors. And so then going deep into those kind of components or working on renewable energy deals or water projects, that really gives you that solid idea of the commercial metrics and the financial drivers of certain industries. So I would for sure say, if you want a financially commercial acumen around sustainability, it is certainly helpful.
Great, thanks, Harry. Edlyn, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, maybe I could add that. Yeah, so at the EDB, we are working very closely with partner agencies like Workforce Singapore to ensure that we have the offerings in place in our local training and workforce development ecosystem to equip Singaporeans to participate in these jobs. Actually, already now in the education system, NUS as well as the Nanyang Technological University already offer sustainability environment focused degrees in environmental studies, environmental engineering, and all these are relevant. At the same time, we're looking at deepening, I think, more vocation specific training programs and kind of more mid-career training programs that can help interested participants level up their skills and enter these sectors mid-career. And finally, I think also a shout out to the SMU as well, the Green Finance Center that was, I think, launched recently, if I recall correctly. That's the first research and talent development institute that will also help to offer a spectrum of training courses across different education levels to build capabilities in sustainable investing, climate science, financial economics, I think all of which are relevant to the carbon services space. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you all for your inputs on that question. For the next question, I'd like to touch on Singapore. There are a number of questions in the Q&A box that relate to the voluntary and compliance carbon markets. So I'll frame it in that context. So Singapore's current nationally determined contribution, or NDC, is to peak our emissions at 65 million tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030. And also as part of our long-term low emissions development strategy, we are aiming to halve our emissions from 65 million tons to 33 million tons of CO2 equivalent by mid-century or 2050. And one of the policy tools that we use here in Singapore is the carbon tax, but it's designed very innovatively as a fixed price credit-based system. So I wondered if will our Carbon Pricing Act need to be amended in order to allow some form of trading for tax liable firms in Singapore and beyond. And in relation to the questions that are being asked, in order to boost carbon trading, Camilla asked, is it pivotal to have a regulated carbon market, a compliance market, or is it possible to just thrive as much with a voluntary market? I would like to pose the question first to Adeline, but then followed closely by Maria and Harry. Adeline.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Melissa, I can maybe just give an update. Yeah, so we are reviewing our, we're, on the carbon tax, we are actually reviewing the post-2023 tax trajectory and level. And, we'll be announcing the outcome of that sometime next year. But on this point about allowing the use of carbon credits, I think that's something that we are studying, the potential use of credits purchased from international carbon markets, as part of the overall review. I think we need to carefully really strike a balance between prioritizing our domestic mitigation efforts, meeting our climate targets, minimizing the economic costs, and at the same time, advancing global climate action. So I think we'll really need to make sure that I think the policies that we put in place, I think sufficiently incentivize action across a portfolio of pathways, as I mentioned earlier, because that's really the effective, and I think it's also a sensible way to really move forward in a tangible manner to advance our climate goals, in Singapore and also in the region and globally. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Maria?
Yes, question. What's really interesting, just to kind of give everyone a context, is that really what's moving the carbon markets internationally right now is voluntary rather than compliance. So just in this quarter or this first half of the year, we're having much more demand and sale of carbon credits. So if you look at the Ecosystems Marketplace latest voluntary report, they really point out to massive demand for carbon credits. This is primarily due to voluntary buyers, and it's primarily due to initiatives that Harry had showed. So there is a lot more companies around the world, global companies around the world, that are committing to net zero and on their way to reduce their emissions. So it really goes to what Harry had said about really prioritizing. Companies are setting targets that are aligned to science. They are then required to set out a reduction plan. And so they're figuring out how to reduce their emissions. But there's an acknowledgement that we aren't there yet when it comes to getting to zero now. So it's very hard to reduce all our emissions right now. So there's interim processes in place, and therefore carbon credits play a role in compensation. And so because right now we're at that beginning part of the journey, carbon compensation has a huge demand for that. There's a lot more investments going in. And so what's actually driving right now the international markets is more voluntary. Over time, though, and as part of the Paris Agreement, there is the notion that governments do put in policies in place that actually go towards compliance, and that creates a stronger signal. And so what we're seeing is just to idea, like in the short term, it's interesting to see the international demand for carbon credits. That's really driven by really big global companies, but over time, it'll be governments taking that integration. And so what we'll see is a move from voluntary to compliance.
Thank you. That was helpful. Harry?
Yeah, so just picking up from what Maria just mentioned, the key is the negotiation for Article 6, which of course, Singapore is co-chairing with Norway, not an easy feat. Essentially, Article 6, among other things, is going to determine how do so-called climate change mitigation outcomes can be transferred from one country to another. So this is a mechanism to be created between the parties to put in a simpler way. Now, then the question is, how do you ensure that when all these corporates are coming up with standards around, claims, or not claims, but ambitions and targets on what pathway they're going to go that's science-based over time, how will the two essentially work together to enable both actors to take that action? And I personally don't believe everything just becoming compliance driven is probably the answer. And perhaps it might take some time for fully compliant, sort of fully harmonized global carbon market that is compliance driven to be created, because different countries have different objectives and they're at different stages of development when it comes to things like even climate mitigation strategies or pathways to creation of markets. So I do believe that both markets have a role to play. And the question is, how can there be another PPP, at a larger scale to ensure that, that there is a credible mechanism in place for all actors to go on a journey on decarbonization, on absolute reduction, but as well as utilize carbon credits.
Thank you. Those are an interesting perspective, Harry, and I'm glad you brought up Article 6 in the COP26 negotiations, which is coming up end of next month. I'd like to turn to perhaps what would be our final question, and this is about nature-based climate solutions. So Ralph Dixon has got the highest voted question in the Q&A box. So I really want to ask his question. He asked, with many organizations and countries targeting net zero, the current high cost of abatement using NBS, nature-based solutions, and carbon capture, storage, sequestration, utilization projects could be a deterrent to the investment and purchase of credits. And he asked, where do you see these costs moving in 2030 and 2050, and how do we stimulate interest in these types of projects?
I think I'll quickly take that question.
Great.
So one, nature-based solutions actually covers many different types of activities. So it could be everything from saving forests and just paying to keep them up to actually reforesting and afforesting. So this has many different project costs and it's very geographically specific. So there's a wide range, but it definitely has right now, the current markets are most interested in nature-based solutions. It and renewable energy comprise the most amount of volume demanded over time, because renewable energy no longer needs carbon financing. We can see a lot more nature-based solutions. So it actually has a lot of attraction towards it. Over time, afforestation, reforestation are there. In terms of prices, we're already seeing by 2030, this is by a study by Trove Research and UCL that was released this year, that carbon credit prices could go to $20 and $50 per ton, and by 2050 by over $50 per ton. But just to keep in mind, whenever companies are making a decision on should I reduce my own emissions versus should I compensate, what becomes cost effective is based on, is it actually cheaper to reduce my own emissions? And the only things that I buy in the end are what I compensate for. So over time, as the carbon credit prices go up, there's more financial incentive for companies to reduce their emissions. But there still will be very hard to abate parts internally. So these prices are the things that they're willing to pay for. But Harry may have a better idea given she's on an exchange, and that's a great way to do price discovery.
Yeah, so that forward-looking hedging of carbon pricing is very important for companies, traders, the ecosystem, right? That's gathering around that carbon credit markets. Now, if we utilize RECs as an example, now RECs pricing hasn't developed equally across the world, but certainly RECs that are produced from renewable energy projects that's domiciled here in Singapore. Because of RE100 commitment, right? So it's a different name, but it's net zero commitment. In the renewable energy world, RE100 means the company commits to utilize 100% renewable energy. If not, then purchase eligible RECs from their own country or where the emission is produced. The pricing, I don't have the exact pricing today, but it's at least $25. And if you look at the forward pricing, it's expected to be within 5 years, 50 plus, right? Of course, the unit is different there, but the prices are actually exponentially increasing. So as more and more commitments are made, indeed, the pricing is going to go up. Actually, the bottleneck is going to be supply, quality supply, because there will be increasing focus on credible decarbonization and credible carbon markets. So actually, there will be more buyers who decide to utilize carbon credits as part of their strategy. More and more companies looking to utilize that quality or high quality carbon credits, and you will see the differentiation in pricing and increasing demand for higher quality.
Thank you. Adeline, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, maybe I can add, building on Harry's last point, yeah, it's really a matter of the dynamics between demand and supply. And I think the question is, for this time round, how can we make sure that we create that virtuous cycle, right? To have, high quality demand and high quality supply. I think being, incentivized, I think to be added into the market for carbon, for carbon, in the region and also globally. And I think, technology plays an important role. We need to look for scalable solutions to effectively measure, verify carbon reductions, as well as co-benefits of nature-based solutions. We also, and I think, I'm confident this time because I think we have a better understanding as well, of the environmental integrity of nature-based solutions. And I think we're continuing to improve that understanding. And so hopefully, as these efforts are undertaken in tandem with the growth of the market, we will hopefully be able to spur that virtuous cycle and really make a real and sustained impact. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone for your excellent and thought-provoking questions. There are 33 of them in the box. I've really enjoyed our discussion, but we have a hard stop at 5 o'clock. And so I apologize that we're not able to take all of your questions, but please be assured that we have noted them down to consider further. You may also reach out to our speakers directly if you wish to follow up. Thank you all for joining us wherever you are in the world and for your active listening and participation. We would really appreciate your feedback on this webinar. On your screen right now, you see a QR code. Please use that and access the link. Use your mobiles, access the link, and give us your feedback as to how we can improve future webinars. So now it leaves me to thank the NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions, the NUS Energy Studies Institute, and the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy for organizing this informative and timely webinar titled Navigating the Carbon Services Industry. Thank you very much also to our speakers, Dr. Maria Carvalho, Ms. Adeline Au, and Ms. Harry Cho for sharing your expert knowledge with us. This is just the start of our conversation, so please do stay in touch with us as we develop the carbon services industry here in Singapore. Thank you very much. Stay safe and have a great week ahead. Goodbye.